Continuing with Brent Allan Winters' Declaration of 76, United States Constitution, a common lawyer comments clause by clause, pages 36 to 43. For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us. Comment. There is no surer way to use civil law to dominate a people than to quarter soldiers in family homes. The home is the refuge of one's heart, soul, and mind. Within its walls lies the family. True authority for self-government, the best health, education, and welfare institution the world will ever know. By inserting British soldiers into homes, King and his co-conspirators brought home and family the building blocks of colonial strength under martial law's direct surveillance and control. Without privacy in the home, government control of a people is total. In short, wherever soldiers occupy, martial law governs. In fact, soldiers quartered in homes become the very eyes and ears of state power, chilling and taking away enjoyment of common law's freedoms of speech and association. The grievance of this Clause 16 is akin to that of Clause 13, only worse, and is the reason behind Amendment 3 of our Constitution, forbidding that any soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner. Clause 17. For protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. Comment. Though soldiers are rightly under martial law, freedom demands that their murdering of non-military men and women subject them to common law courts with its jury. Otherwise, government will use its soldiers to eliminate opposition without fear of punishment. But the King and Parliament ordered that any British officer or soldier accused of violence be sent to another colony or England to get a sweetheart trial. The King and Parliament were keeping all such murderers from the common law courts and in the martial law courts, ensuring acquittal. Common law requires its courts to have final jurisdiction over the affairs of all civil law tribunals, martial, admiralty, canon, and administrative. Hence, in America, appeals from military courts are to the federal courts. Further, common law requires soldiers be tried in common law's non-military courts for felonies done against non-military persons. In short, soldiers and sailors are all subject to the same rule of law and accorded the same rights of trial by jury as non-military. However, King George tried his soldiers and officials in his own civil law tribunals before judges dependent on him for their jobs and pay, holding his kept men above the law in the United States. Soldiers and sailors are tried as all others in the common law court of the state having jurisdiction over felonies done within it. Clause 18. For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. Comment. Here our declaration cites King George's denial of the colonists' common law rights of freedom of association, which includes freedom of contract, and the inestimable benefits resulting from the free and unhampered exercise of these rights in trade and commerce. King and Parliament had granted a trading monopoly to the East India Company, which at that time commanded a fleet of over 2,500 merchant ships and the protection of the British Navy and Army. The King and his cronies granted the East India Company's corporate-like charter, invested in it and its offshoot monopolies, outfitted the British Navy and Army to enforce its mercantile monopolies, and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people, collecting money to fund even more oppressions and abuses. Monopolies of trade, being unnatural, are against the common law. and therefore dominate only by unlawful government force to command. Lord Cope. Clause 19. For imposing taxes on us without our consent. Comment. The common law has always forbidden levying of taxes without legislative advice and consent. Common law requires government to follow a certain process in order to tax a people. The course of this process, due and owing from government, includes obtaining the taxpayer's consent. Because taxation without consent wanders from the course of the common law, it violates the law of the land, which says the Supreme Court is Magna Carta's phrase for due process. The due process our Constitution requires for government's exercise of its taxing powers, to introduce and pass tax legislation, to lay and collect taxes is due and owing to each person. But King George, using Parliament, taxed the colonies while barring them both from forming local legislatures to give or withhold consent to taxation, and from sending representatives to Parliament to debate and cast a vote to give or withhold consent. To sum up, ownership of property, such as money, is a constitutionally protected right. Taxation is government's taking of property. Consequently, common law demands that government, in laying and collecting taxes, follow the law of the land, due process, in getting constitutional consent. See U.S. Constitution Amendments 5 and 14. Clause 20. For depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury. Comment. Rhode Island's loathing of civil law was so strong that she conducted her Vice Admiralty Court, a kind of a civil law tribunal, using the jury. Consequently, conviction of merchants was rare. Massachusetts' hatred for civil law was so strong, she refused to establish equity courts until 1873, and for good reason. Experience shows that without a true and impartial common law jury, government will control the outcome of the cases, i.e., replacing its will for personal freedom. In short, trial by jury becomes trial by government. The British extended civil law's admiralty jurisdiction among the colonists in order to deny the right to freedom from unlawful searches and seizures and the right to trial by jury. See Brent Allan Winters' Excellence of the Common Law, section 3.10.3, discussing James Otis's pamphlet Writs of Assistance. By denying these rights, the king lowered enforcement costs of tax collection, benefiting England's central bank interest holders, their East India trade monopoly, and its dependents. King George set up boards of bureaucrats with unconstitutional powers to extend the jurisdiction of admiralty courts, not only for collecting taxes, but also for the trial of all cases arising within the colony. One Journal Continental Congress, 1774 to 1789, pages 63 to 73. In our day, it would be as if IRS agents, an administrative civil law arm of the executive branch, sat as judges without any jury over all felony, misdemeanor, tort, and contract cases. In fact, the IRS now extends its power to enforce and judge matters concerning new health care bill. Our declaration teaches above all things that the powers that be are creative without end in devising schemes to deny trial by jury. Why? Because the jury threatens those ever-present government dependents out to abuse their power through terror, domination, jailing, and plundering. Clause 21. For transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. Comment. The common law tradition is against wholesale manufacturing of crimes by legislative decree. In short, If the behavior in question seriously injured no one else, it is no crime. According to common law, the jury best recognizes crimes in hindsight, not some legislator trying to control future behavior, speculating through administrative codes, decrees, and other legislation. Civil law demands that one's private conscience yield to the state's will, commanded by its codes. Private conscience, said Melvin's Captain Vere, must yield to that conscience imperially formulated in the code. In short, the end, the government's will, justifies the means, obedience to the statute's command. Hence, says the civil law, obedience to government is a full defense to crime. This principle has fostered the atrocities of Babylon, Egypt, Rome, Nazism, communism, and Islam. Again, King George's prosecutors were accusing Americans of crimes, but instead of respecting their right to be tried for their common law jury of their peers, neighbors, each in his own colony and county, the king removed them to civil law's admiralty tribunals in England. In justification, Parliament had resurrected a forgotten statute that Henry VIII had signed over 200 years before. Unlike the common law, in the civil law tradition, crimes are against the state, personified in its chief officer. Hence, all crimes are personal offenses against him, making punishments a matter of his personal vengeance instead of a reckoning according to the rule of law. Beware, the more false crime rulers manufacture, the more rulers dominate and control people using the terror of prosecutorial threat and vengeance. Delegates to the First Congress meeting to address Parliament's reaction to the Boston Tea Party all agreed, quote, the respective colonies are entitled to the common law of England, and more especially to the great and inestimable privilege of being tried by their peers of the vicinage according to the course of that law, end quote. For this reason, as far back as the 14th century, John Wycliffe had persuaded Parliament to bar any Englishman from being tried outside England without leave of Parliament. Never forget, a jury of one's peers are one's neighbors, those living about one's home. Clause 22, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies. Comment. The British government's replacing of American common law courts with admiralty tribunals broke faith with British Americans. Here, however, the signers refer to the king and his cronies' indirect plan to displace common law protections, the free system of English laws. With civil law inquisitions, by having made Roman canon law official in Quebec, then extending that civil law, which demands none of the common law rights included in our Constitution's Bill of Rights, into the British American colonies. Almost 19 months before, on 14 October 1774, the threat of this scheme moved the colonies to form our first true Congress, which then gave the hue and cry. King in Parliament's Act establishing the Roman Catholic religion in Quebec, abolishing English laws, and erecting a tyranny there, to the great danger from so total a dissimilarity of religion, law, and government of the neighboring British colonies, by whose blood and treasure the said country was conquered from France. By the word so total a dissimilarity of religion, law, and government of the neighboring British colonies, Congress refers to the Quebec Act, by which the king and parliament were erecting a tyranny of Roman civil canon law government in Quebec, the neighboring province. See Sam Adams, Canon and Feudal Law, 1765, which cut off the claims of Massachusetts, Connecticut, Virginia, and New York to their western lands, and placed these lands under of Quebec's French Catholic jurisdiction. The words, the assistance of whose blood and treasure the said country was conquered from France, refers to the British American colonies' giving of wealth and lives in the French and Indian War. Quote, a great struggle for supremacy, end quote, says Coffin, quote, between two races, two languages, two religions, and two systems of laws, end quote. Through that struggle, Britain conquered Quebec, ridding the New World of France's Roman law, priestcraft, inquisition, and proselytizing through terrorism by torture and murder. At the final showdown on the plains of Abraham in Quebec, the armies of Britain and France decided the fate of the continent by battle in favor of the common law. But now, says our declaration, King George has reestablished Rome's arbitrary religion, law, and government. As had the Christian reformers, America's founders discerned the struggle for liberty to be against the powers of priestcraft, the temptation of all religious organizations. Quote, in every country and in every age, the priest has been hostile to liberty. He is always in alliance with the despot, abetting his abuses in return for protection to his own, end quote. Thomas Jefferson. Since Rome's empire and long before, the civil law in its many forms has been the state's tool of domination. Once put in place and accepted, domination and fleecing of the people is easier. Over the centuries, Roman-styled civil law has devised methods of engulfing neighboring people, using what the Germans now call Gemeinsreich, a people's observance of civil law that has risen from the influence of its arbitrary government, says Fuller, in a neighboring province. Knowing that England's central bank must keep the British American colonies under civil law government for easy enforcement of its East India Company's trading and offshoot monopolies, King George, his co-conspirators, and other kept men set about to establish civil canon law in Quebec, then using it as a fit instrument of absolute rule, planned to enlarge its boundaries, allowing its tentacles to grope, snatch, and bleed more and more colonists of their work and wealth.